The Battle of Trafalgar was one of the most influential and famous battles in British naval history, considering all that was on the line for the three major participating colonies, the French, Spanish, and British. First, we're going to talk about the First French Empire, which was under Napoleon Bonaparte's lead in the early 1800s. While under Napoleon Bonaparte's lead, the First French Empire was the dominant military land power and over the entire European continent, but the British Royal Navy controlled the seas. Napoleon wanted to take over all of Europe and engaged in a few battles, one with Britain in which he lost, so he then decided to move on to some smaller states and slowly make his way up to fully conquering Europe. The British, getting word of this, imposed a naval blockade on France, which affected trade and kept the French from fully mobilizing their naval resources. This allowed the British to attack French interests with ease. This obviously got the other states' attention, considering that the blockade blocked their trading routes too, which made them start to defend their own trading routes. Denmark, Russia, and Sweden all formed an alliance against Britain, but British Navy quickly attacked Denmark's capital, Copenhagen, in 1801, forcing them to break the alliance with Russia and Sweden. The Russian Tsar, Paul I, died, and his son soon after, Alexander I, came to the throne and was more lenient with Britain. With that, the anti-British alliance basically disappeared. The French and British continued back and forth, fighting over and over again all throughout 1801. But a peace treaty was eventually signed in March of 1802, where the British promised to return the French colonies they had taken over and leave Malta and Egypt, while Napoleon had to give control back to the Naples and the Papal States. Europe was at peace for some time until the United Kingdom got worrisome of Napoleon because he was asserting control over Switzerland. Napoleon started to assemble a force in the city of Boulogne in France to invade the British Isles. Instead, the United Kingdom was the one who declared the war first, which was then known as the Third Coalition in 1803. Napoleon was not expecting this at all, as his fleet was scattered across the Atlantic, which gave the advantage to the British Navy, who then blocked both ports through France. Napoleon made plans to somehow break through the barricades and get his army from Boulogne to across the English Channel. In October, the British sank two Spanish vessels, mistaking them for French vessels, which made Spain declare war upon the United Kingdom, allying themselves with the French in December, making it completely worse for Great Britain. In the late March of 1805, the French commander Vice Admiral Pierre Villeneuve orders his fleet of ships to sail out towards British outposts. He was able to evade blockades set up by the British commander, Vice Admiral Nelson. Nelson was completely sure that Napoleon would try and land force in Italy, so the majority of Nelson's vessels were around the Mediterranean island Sardinia, leaving the British outposts wide open. The French fleet sent by Villeneuve arrived at the Caribbean Sea basin in May and took over a few British outposts before Admiral Nelson was able to even get to the outposts in June, a whole month behind Villeneuve. Despite all of their efforts, the French were able to do as much as a dent to the British colonies, and they started moving back to Europe. A small British fleet was ordered to prevent Villeneuve and his French troops from reaching the city of Brest to lift the barricade, and they were successful, forcing the French and Spanish to return to Cadiz. Austria and Russia also joined the Third Coalition, which forced Napoleon to march his army in Boulogne to the east, meaning the attack on the British was held back. Admiral Nelson sent most of his fleet to block Villeneuve off the coast of France. By the end of September, Nelson personally joined his fleet to fight alongside of him. After a while, Admiral Villeneuve received an order from Napoleon to move towards Italy, but ignored it. On October 18th, he received yet another order from Napoleon that stated to stay in Cadiz and wait for his replacement, but yet again, he neglected it. On the 21st of October, Villeneuve's fleet of ships were closing in the Straits of Gibraltar, until they were surprised by 27 British fleets cornering them, with Admiral Nelson leading the charge. At this point, the 33 French and Spanish fleets were too far from Cadiz to retreat, and they had to fight back. But what Villeneuve didn't know is how strong Admiral Nelson's naval fleet was. The French and Spanish tried retreating, but weren't able to execute the turns back to the harbor, which resulted in failure. Admiral Nelson directly attacked the broadside of the French and Spanish fleet, leading the charge in his own ship, Victory. Admiral Nelson shouted his famous saying, "England expects that every man shall do his duty." Chaos ensued, with cannon shots, ship crashing into one another, musket fire, and ships entirely exploding. Despite all of this, no British ships were even damaged in all of this mix-up. But many of the British soldiers were wounded or died. This video clip is basically explaining the whole scene with Admiral Nelson and all the ships going against each other just a little bit better with the visual part than me.
Allowed the French to move as far away from Cadiz as possible to prevent them from retreating. However, by dawn the British vessels were detected. Villeneuve didn't expect Nelson's navy to be so strong, so he ordered his ships back to the harbour. This manoeuvre failed due to lack of training, and the Allied fleet ended up with an incoherent line. The usual tactic of the age was to approach a foe and enter a shooting match, so the fate of the battle was decided by the quality of the ships, crew training, and sheer luck. Instead, Nelson divided his fleet into two halves to attack the Allies broadside. He was personally leading the northern group that had 13 ships of the line, with his flagship Victory in front, while Vice Admiral Collingwood's squadron of 14 ships of the line was to the south, led by the flagship Royal Sovereign. By midday, the distance between the two navies was just 5 kilometers. They were off the coast of Cape Trafalgar, and Nelson issued his famous order. England expects that every man will do his duty. Royal Sovereign was recently repaired and was faster than most ships, so the wind moved it dangerously close to the enemy line, while the other ships in the squadron were lagging behind. At 12:20, Royal Sovereign fired the first volley upon Santa Ana and Forgo, and these vessels shot back. Collingwood's flagship was attacked by 4 enemy ships. Only 15 minutes later, Belle-Île arrived and covered the right board of Royal Sovereign. More English vessels moved into the fray and tried to cut the Allied line, but Collingwood was outnumbered at the initial point of contact. Still, the positioning of the Allied navy didn't allow its second-line ships to assist, and by 1400, the majority of the first-line vessels were either sunk or surrendered. To the north, Nelson's squadron got close to the enemy line by 12:20, but the wind was calming, and that made Nelson's ships a very slow target. His refusal to fight using traditional line tactics was detrimental at this point of the battle, as none of his ships were able to shoot, while the enemy was sending volley after volley. Despite casualties, the flagship Victory was moving forward. Nelson ordered a fake maneuver to make the enemy think that his ships would form up in a line, but instead he then ordered one more turn, and Victory ended up between the French flagship Bucentaure and the smaller Redoutable. This allowed Nelson's ship to use the guns on both sides. The French ships needed to turn, and Victory used that to take Bucentaure out of the game. However, Victory itself was taking massive damage from Redoutable. The French ship was also using sharpshooters, and at 13:15, one of their shots wounded Nelson. It was clear that this wound was deadly. Redoutable's crew attempted to board Victory, but the British managed to stop them. Victory was soon reinforced by Téméraire, which moved across Redoutable's left board and started shooting. And by 14:20, Redoutable was captured by the crew of Téméraire. To the north, British Neptune entered into a battle with Spanish Santísima Trinidad and managed to take it out of the fight. By 1400, it was becoming clear for Villeneuve that he was losing the battle, and he ordered the northern portion of his line to move to the southwest and collapse on the British fleet. However, the captains of these ships failed to see the signal, and this became the final mistake of the Allied fleet. Villeneuve's Bucentaure was in no shape to continue fighting, and soon with the bid. By the time the remaining 10 Allied ships started their move to assist, most of the vessels in the centre were either sunk or captured. Collingwood took overall command of the British Navy and ordered Nelson's squadron to intercept the French reinforcements. The remaining Allied ships decided to retreat. It was a complete victory.
As I had said in the beginning, the Battle of Trafalgar was among the most important naval wars that Britain ever took part in. The French defeat at Trafalgar confirmed the naval dominance of the United Kingdom all over Europe. Not only did this establish naval dominance, but it also gave the UK undisputed control over the sea, and it established British supremacy for over a century. Also, Napoleon was no longer able to invade Britain after he was defeated. Now, the triumph was the British winning the war and establishing British supremacy for over a century. And then the tragedy for the British would obviously be Admiral Nelson's death during the Battle of Trafalgar.